Hello, I'm Judith Leary-Joyce, otherwise known as the Queen of Insulation. I'm not a professional, but I am a homeowner who's done our own retrofit, and then I wrote the Beginner's Guide to Eco-Renovation to help other people know where to start. And this video is about looking at internal wall insulation and how you actually fit it to the wall. I'm going to focus on sustainable materials because there's already loads of stuff on the web that'll tell you how to fix PIR. So go and take a look at those if that's the direction you're going in. For this video, we'll look at the options for installing sustainable products that work well for a healthy home and are better for the environment. And I'm going to look at 3 different options for installing internal wall insulation. First is with a stud framework. Then there's the option of thermal plaster, and third, directly applying the insulation to the wall. But first, a little bit of encouragement to keep you going. We're saving 75% of our energy usage in a 1901 Victorian terrace. EPC's gone from a D to a B, and the house is worth a lot more now because of the retrofit. Not to mention that we're warmer and more comfortable than we've ever been. And of course, we're helping reduce the 21% of UK emissions that comes from leaky homes. So this is really worth doing. One final comment before we get going is that insulation and airtightness are great for keeping the place warm. But you must always add in ventilation to manage the moisture that we just produce by living. Without good ventilation, you're going to end up with condensation and mould, which is definitely not the outcome you're looking for. So let's start with preparation. Remember, you're talking primarily the external walls of your house. You can insulate adjoining walls if you want to for sound, or if the house next door is very cold. But generally, we're just talking about insulating inside the outside walls, which may be a good bit of reassurance if you're worried about space. You're not going to be building out every wall in your room. So your first task is to clear the wall space. Take off any wall furnishings like fireplaces, coving, that's the bit that links the ceilings to the wall, and the skirting board. Depending upon how much insulation you're putting up, you may want to remove the architrave from round the window. You also need to think about how are you going to manage the pipes and electrical wires in a way that's safe for you and won't damage the insulation. If you have space, you can build in a service void for the wiring and the pipes. This is normally put on the room side of the insulation and save you having to have breaks in the whole system. If you don't have the space to do that, then the wires can be chased into the plaster layer or into the insulation, but more about that below. And I'll also put some links in the description that'll tell you more about how to do that safely. So let's start with the stud framework. This works when you want to use a flexible insulation like wood fibre or hemp or even denim. Now, you'll probably have gone back to the brick, but if you're not sure about that, I'll put a link to another video here so you can find out more of why you would want to do it. If you are back to the brick and it's left you with a rough wall, then you may need to add a skim of plaster to give you a good surface to work with. Remember, when you're using sustainable materials that are breathable, everything else must be breathable too, so you'll need to use lime plaster or a thermal plaster like diathanite, but I'll say a bit more about that later on. The first layer on the wall is the airtight membrane. This is like a windproof jacket for your house, and it cuts out all the uncontrolled air. The membrane goes across all the walls and into the doorways and the window reveals. Now, this is only going to work well if you seal it up completely, wall to floor, wall to ceiling, wall to doorway and window. There's a special tape you can buy for doing this. It's extremely sticky and very effective in closing up any gaps. I'll put you a link in the description below. You also need to join the layers of the membrane together, but they've actually got a sticky edge built in that makes that very easy. The next step is to attach a wooden framework to the wall that can hold the insulation. Clearly this is going to have to be screwed into the wall, which means a hole in the airtight membrane, which is not what you want. But fear not, there are special screws that have wider heads so they cover up any air gaps. Wood itself is a very good insulator, so it works well with your insulation batts. And if you build the frame from scratch, you can make it fit the size of the insulation batts, and that makes life a whole lot easier and a lot less cutting to do. You'll get the best outcome when the bat sits really tightly into the space. This also ensures that the bat won't slump over time, leaving cold areas within the framework. So talk to your carpenter and make sure they're clear on the width of the bat. And if they can make the framework just slightly smaller than the bat frame, then you'll really have to shove it in. Then it's time to start putting the bats in. If you're not sure which insulation to use, then take a look at this video and that'll give you a lot more information. Now, this bit's really satisfying. We did a lot of this ourselves, partly because it wasn't a difficult job, so we could. But it also meant we could be sure the framework was totally filled. Effective insulation is often a matter of being nitpicky, so that you don't leave any cold gaps, and we wanted to make sure it was absolutely right. Once all the insulation's in place, then it's time to add a top layer that can take plaster. There are wood fibre equivalents of plasterboard made from rigid wood fibre, and often they're tongue and groove, and that adds another bit of support to the airtightness. Then you're into plastering and decor, which I'll cover in another video, but just to mention quickly here, remember if you're using breathable, sustainable insulation, you need to finish it off with lime plaster, which is also breathable, and then of course breathable paints and wallpaper. Now let's look at the second option, which is a thermal plaster. This is the diathanite that I mentioned earlier. This is a form of spray-on insulation. But don't worry, I'm not talking foam insulation here. It can be applied to any thickness, which is a real benefit. We put it internally on the front wall of our house so we could smooth it around the bay window. Because of the bay, that means we've got different thicknesses. It ranges from 60mm to 100mm on that wall. Then you need to put lime plaster on top of it because, as with all other forms of sustainable insulation, it's fully breathable. It's also non-toxic, so it's a really good choice. And there's also a version for external wall insulation. So if you've got an old house and you're thinking of insulating externally, then do go and explore diathanite. The final option is rigid wall insulation. The advantage of this is that you don't have to build the wooden framework, so it's a much simpler job. Same process, go back to the brick to make sure there's no defects on the wall and no problems with the plaster itself. If you're left with a rough surface again, you need to make it smooth. You can use ordinary lime plaster, or you could use diathanite. To my mind, any way that you can add a bit more thermal performance is good, so a skim of diathanite means you're getting every ounce of benefit from your work. You can then add an airtight layer over the top of the plaster, or if you're using diathanite, that will give you the airtight layer. All you need to do is put the tape on the wall before the diathanite, between the join of the ceiling to the wall and the wall to the floor, and then plaster up over the edge of the tape so no air can get through. If you're using a membrane, then you just seal it in the same way as we described before. With regard to your electrics and your pipes, you have the option of embedding them into the plaster, but for that it needs to be 20 to 30mm thick. They will of course all need to be put in trunking to protect them. If you want to do that, then having a thermal plaster makes a lot more sense because that thickness, you really want it to be adding some thermal value. Now, this is definitely not an area of expertise for me, so please make sure to check the best way of doing this with the supplier of the insulation and with your electrician. They'll know exactly what you need to do. Then your rigid insulation, which can be hempcrete blocks or wood fibre blocks, can then be stuck to the wall with a breathable glue. Some of these rigid bats can be tongue and groove like this one, and that gives an extra bit of cover for your airtightness. And the big advantage is that you can plaster directly on top of the bat, so there's no need for that extra layer. So that's pretty much it. The biggest challenge here in my experience is finding a lime plasterer. They're like hen's teeth, but once you've got someone lined up, you're on your way. We did our bedroom with rigid fibre in just 2 weeks, so it's not a massive job and the benefits are enormous. So if you have any questions, please let me know. If I don't know the answer, I'll find someone who does. And let me know how you're getting on. I'd love to hear.